Hi, my name is Morris Franco. This is the sixth in a series of videos I'm doing on the national debt crisis. In this video, I attempt to back up my claim that there's a good possibility the United States government will default on a portion of the Treasury securities that fund the national debt. I believe that if the government doesn't act soon to control the national debt, this restructuring will be the only way out and will take place before the latest 30-year bond matures, and probably much sooner. The other 5 videos I did lay out the groundwork for this presentation, and hopefully will lay to rest that to present me as some sort of raving lunatic with a personal political agenda. I assure you this is not the case. I am nothing more than a concerned American who is worried about the path our country has taken and wants to share this concern with like-minded Americans. In the previous 5 videos, I explained some of the issues associated with the ballooning national debt, even forecasting an annual debt interest of over $1 trillion within the next 4 to 5 years. I hate to be the preacher of gloom and doom, and sincerely hope that I am wrong in my analysis and projections, but as far as I'm concerned, doing nothing is not an option. I will present my views on how I think this issue will play out, and of course you can make your own judgment. If you viewed the other videos in this series, some of what I'm going to say will seem redundant, but I think it's best that I try to make this a standalone video. One of my basic principles is that if it ain't perfect, there's room for improvement. I read through this presentation at least 5 times in preparation for this video. Each time I make some changes to improve it. As a result, I don't think I'm going to get the whole thing done in one video. In fact, I know I'm not. It'll take 2 videos. YouTube gave me some static about putting my 5th video on, which ran 32 minutes. This write-up on the possible default by the U.S. government was completed in the last at least 6 months after the section on a countdown to Armageddon. If some of my presumptions change, it's because I'm trying to analyze a moving target. All of my opinions are based on a what-if scenario. In any case, I'm presenting a situation which, if no action is taken, our country will face serious problems. In presenting my opinion on this subject, I have to throw loads of numbers at you. I must admit, even as I read what I wrote, I still found it very confusing. I need to make a few suggestions. 1, it's important that you also view the video on the National Debt Crisis Part 5, Countdown to Armageddon first, as it leads to the purpose of this video. I also suggest you not try to digest all the numbers in your first hearing. I also think the charts I will show you will be difficult to read, so if you want a closer look, I suggest you freeze the video and give it a careful look. Perhaps you would be more impressed if I was wearing a suit, holding a pipe, making this presentation from the library at Harvard University, surrounded by shelves of economics and law books and portraits of famous alumni. But that's not me. However, I did write a book on this subject titled The National Debt Crisis, America's Armageddon. And I'll show you the book. Book is right here. Okay. If you saw my other 5 excuse me. If you saw my other 5 videos on this subject, you probably concluded there is a method to my madness. The book got a good review from the major book reviewer, Kirkus Reviews. That's K-I-R-K-U-S, Kirkus Reviews, who praised the analysis of the national debt, but were not too positive about the 1/3 of the book devoted to subjects where I showed my conservative bias. 2/3 of the book is devoted to the national debt, and I'll read you the quotes. They're on the back of the book, and this is what they had to say. I agree I was selective in what I put down. The first one says, indeed, Franco's focus on the pernicious effect of interest is what distinguishes this analysis from many other books devoted to the debt. 2, Although the book's economic predictions are dreary, readers are spared any hectoring. In fact, the tone is often quite surprisingly light, even when delivering the grimmest news. 3. Presents a well-reasoned introduction to the national debt and its problems it poses to the country's future fiscal health. Not bad. May I suggest you purchase a few dozen copies? I'm not interested in being famous, but it would be nice to be rich. The entire review can be seen on the Kirkus Review website under the title of the book or under the author's name. Before I go on, I have to show you a few charts. The first chart I call Statistics that tell the story. I gather what I believe is important data related to the subject, and I will show you the chart. Okay. Okay, on this chart I show the year on column 2, the country's GDP, gross domestic product, for the growth rate for the year. Column 3, the actual GDP in dollars. Column 4, the inflation rate. Column 5, the budget deficit for the year. Column 6, debt interest for the year. Column 7, the size of the national debt. And column 8, debt interest as a percent of the budget deficit. The last column has absolutely no value. I say right here, but there's no sense in showing it here. I say take a look at column 3, which shows the annual GDP. GDP is the gross domestic product. That's what it stands for. Loosely defined, measures the output in every class of enterprise to arrive at the total. That was one of the Wikipedia definitions. It's the main indicator of how much money changes hands in the economy. The growth in the GDP rate means more money is moving throughout the economy and therefore more tax revenue. I wanted to point out a lot of things on this chart, but I think this video will run too long as it is. Show chart 2, the next 30 years. Alright, this is chart 2, the next 30 years. This chart shows how fast the debt will grow based on a fixed interest rate from 5% to 8% from 2020 to 2043, which was 30 years into the future at the time this was originally written. The chart assumes a $22 trillion national debt starting in 2020. How I arrived at this number is explained in great detail in my video, The Countdown to Armageddon. On this chart, I also presume that the previous year's debt interest will be added to the national debt and not included in the annual budget deficit. Let me repeat that statement. On this chart, I also presume the previous year's debt interest will be added to the national debt and not included in the annual budget. In my opinion, this is the most likely scenario. Now, don't forget that starting in 2020, I am forecasting $1 trillion plus annual debt interest. At a 5% rate by 2043, the national debt will be $67 trillion. That's compounding at 5% rate for 23 consecutive years. At a 6% rate, it's $84 trillion. At 7%, $104 trillion. And at 8%, $129 trillion. I included the 6, 7, and 8 rates because I believe there's a good possibility that the Federal Reserve will have limited control on rates when debt skyrockets and bond vigilantes enter the picture. Show growth by inflation. Show. Okay. This is another chart, and this shows how the debt will rise based on 3 different inflation rates. Now remember, here we're talking about inflation and not interest. And here I start with the national debt as it was in 2013, 16 trillion, as opposed to the other chart where I started with 22 trillion in 2020. While on the surface these numbers may look insane, Let me show you these figures, which I just did. If you want to know how much the national debt would grow just from inflation with no additional debt increases from budget deficits, take a look at the chart I just showed you. It shows if you start 2013 with a national debt of 16.7 trillion and grow at a steady 3% inflation rate, by 2043 the debt would reach 40 trillion, at a 4% rate 54 trillion, at a 5% rate 72 trillion. Don't get these two mixed up. The previous chart started in 2020 with a presumed national debt of 22 trillion and calculates the growth based on interest rate. This chart is based on the inflation rate and starts with a 2013 national debt of 16 trillion. Here's another chart for you to look at. And this is national debt stats 1988 to 2011. And I start with 2011 and work backwards. And what I show is debt interest in billions, the size of the national debt, and what percent of the national debt the interest was. And if you follow it all the way down to the bottom, you'll see for the 24 year average, it was 5%, 4.99. And for the 20-year average, not counting the last 4 years, it was 5.8%. Okay, now I'll read you what I wrote. So I just showed you. The third chart shows interest paid on national debt for the last 24 years, from 2011 to back to 1988. These were the most recent numbers available when I wrote this in 2013. As you can see, the average interest rate over the period was 5%. If you omit the last 4 years, when the Fed's super low rate policy was in effect, the average rate was 5.8%. Oh, now I'll show you the chart that'll blow your mind. This is chart 4. This you can see clearly. It shows the national debt in 1984, 1.5 trillion. It shows what the national debt, current national debt, at least the time I wrote the book, 2013, 16 trillion 740 million. The growth over the last 30 years was 1,073%. If we grow at the same rate in the next 30 years as we did in the last 30 years, 30 years from now, the national debt will be $179 trillion. So that's to give you a picture of what we're talking about, and trillions are like tossing around like they're nothing. But the numbers I'm throwing at you are realistic. Alright, I'll read what it says. Let me show you these mind-blowing stats. 1984, the national debt was 1.56 trillion. In 2013, it reached 16.7 trillion. That's an increase of 1,073% over the 30 years. Apply the same rate of growth to the next 30 years and you look at a national debt of almost 180 trillion. You may want to point out that the debt ballooned over the last 5 years because of the trillion dollar budget deficits. And of course this is correct. But let me add this. In a normal economy, it is likely the majority of those deficits would have still been there, as the deficits were due mostly to expensive government programs that were unrelated to the recession. The only borrowing the government actually did that was tied to the recession was the 740 billion stimulus program that I think was in 2008. In addition, because of the recession, the Federal Reserve kept interest rates near record lows and, in my opinion, reduced government spending. If you remember correctly, $2.7 trillion over 550 billion a year in my countdown to Armageddon thing. So I see, as outrageous as these numbers are, they are realistic. Back to the subject at hand. Alright, back to the book. Alright, I start with a chapter called Predictions, which I forgot to read. I should have read it already. The United States will default on its debt and the Federal Reserve will become irrelevant, is the title of the paragraph. I cannot emphasize strongly enough the financial crisis facing our country as a result of the national debt, out-of-control spending, and budget overruns. The deeper I get into this analysis, the more certain I am that the United States default is almost inevitable. Our country is on the road to financial Armageddon, and I see no hope of stopping it. The worst case scenario is that it will end American exceptionalism in its truest form. I hope this video serves as a wake-up call to all concerned Americans. Purchasing 30-year Treasury bonds is a bad idea. There's a good chance you won't get all your principal back. Looking ahead to 2043, when the current 30-year bonds mature, predicting the state of the economy, the size of the budget deficits, and the national debt is all but impossible. If no corrective action is taken, there's a high probability the United States will have to restructure much of its outstanding Treasury securities and return to investors only a portion of their original investments. The consequences of such a default would be political and social Armageddon. What actions must the government take to precipitate this crisis? The answer is none. That's right, none. Because the policies that will cause this default are already in place. The government's inability to balance the budget, plus interest rates returning to normal, all by themselves will cause the crisis. New budget-busting government programs will serve only to solidify the crisis. Okay, now I'm going to read you what the conclusions I got from the charts, and I want to emphasize it's more than just the charts, it's everything that I wrote up to this point. What I believe the charts say about, one, the national debt. The national debt has already reached critical mass, and debt interest will gradually become the largest expense in the budget. Interest on the national debt will exceed $1 trillion annually soon after interest rates return to normal, 5% to 6%. Within 3 years, the national debt will exceed $20 trillion. Dumping the annual interest and only debt interest for 30 years onto the national debt will cause the debt to grow to between $65 trillion and $125 trillion by 2043. Dumping budget shortfalls from both discretionary and non-discretionary programs in addition to debt interest for 30 years will push debt to even higher levels, tens of trillions of dollars at a minimum. What the charts say about the government. The government has no stomach for taking necessary steps to balance the budget and will continue to spend well in excess of revenues received. We will not be able to grow our way out of the national debt crisis because GDP growth will be nowhere near enough to offset the growth caused by budget deficits. If interest rates had been at normal rates for the last 6 years, debt interest would be at least $1 trillion and account for more than 20% of the entire current budget. Bond vigilantes will see weakness, sell short, and dump their securities onto the open market, causing rates to spike out of control. This will force the U.S. government to restructure debt, resulting in a partial default. The major rating agencies will downgrade U.S. debt as the debt load becomes more and more unmanageable, which will force interest rates and budget deficits, which will force higher interest rates and budget deficits. What the chart says about the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve's low-rate policies has enabled the government to mask the seriousness of the national debt crisis. The Federal Reserve's attempt to force low interest rate by purchasing large quantities of bonds will prove useless as they lose their credibility. The Federal Reserve's ability to fight inflation will be severely hampered because upward interest rate adjustments on a huge national debt will create massive budget deficits and massive increases in debt. Let me show you something else. Okay. This is the inflation rate from 1976 to 1985. Okay. As you can see, in the years 1980, 81, and 82, interest rates were pushing 12 and 13%. That's what the Fed had to do to fight inflation. If you notice, over the entire 10-year period, interest rates averaged over 10%. So if you factor that into the last 50 years, that would certainly push the average up substantially. Do you remember the oil price in the early 1980s with long lines at the pumps? Look at this chart, and that's the one I just showed you. Inflation became a major problem, and the Federal Reserve had to take aggressive action with interest rates. From 1980 through 1982, the Fed pushed rates past 12%. In fact, if you notice, the average rate over the 10-year period was over 10%. This would certainly boost the 50-year average to well over 6%. What if this happened today and we had a debt of 18 trillion? Take a look. And I have another chart to show. Okay, this is what would happen if the Fed had to fight inflation today and raise interest rates to 12%. On an $18 trillion debt, it would cost them $864 billion in year 1, $1.1 trillion in year 2, $1.5 trillion in year 3, for a total of $3.5 trillion in just 3 years if the Fed had to fight inflation with an $18 trillion debt. That's like a quarter of the budget. Anyway, I pointed that out here. I was supposed to do it later because I just read the paragraph that the Fed will lose its ability to fight inflation. And that's what I mean by that statement. More about the Fed. Accommodative interest rates enable the government to continue to incur massive budget deficits while paying minimal debt interest. What it says about the government's owning up to the crisis. The government will not act on the national debt crisis until it is forced to by out-of-control interest rates. Massive budget cuts will severely affect all spending programs, including defense, government pensions, and entitlements. The United States and most of the free world will undergo a severe recession. Unemployment will skyrocket. The stock market will lose half its value and interest rates will soar. Social unrest will result from massive cuts from all government programs. Okay, the government, I don't have much more before I take a break. The government's attitude problem. I assure you everything I'm reading is all related to the big picture, although it may not seem so by the title of paragraphs. The Budget Sequestration Act, put into effect in 2013, forced the government to reduce spending by $85 billion. The President and his supporters cried foul in front of the Republican wing of the Congress was heartlessly cutting important spending programs, and citizens would suffer consequences. It was all nonsense, of course, but it does highlight the party in power's resistance to fiscal discipline. How do you think they would react to $1.5 trillion in austerity measures, almost 17 times greater than the $85 billion in which they panicked? The $1.5 trillion is my estimated budget deficit if you go back to the Armageddon place. Okay, here I come to a very important, what I think is a very important paragraph. Growing the debt without pain. The national debt grew about 70% to almost $17 trillion in 2013 from $10 trillion in 2008. The Fed's low interest rate policy was in effect throughout the period, yet the amount of debt interest paid barely budged from year to year. This was made possible by the fact that debt issued prior to the Fed's low rate policy yielded higher rates and upon maturity rolled over to the current low rates. This had the effect of keeping the growth of the national debt out of the public eye, as the government was able to increase the size of the national debt massively without having to increase the comparable amount of debt interest. I'll repeat this paragraph again at the start of the next video. But before I do that, I'm going to close this out with the assumptions I'm making in this video. And I want to tell you what they are, and you can accept them or reject them, but I will explain them to you. Number one, I'm assuming returning to normal interest rates at around 6% will add at least $800 billion to the deficit, meaning that when you add in what we're already paying in debt interest, it will bring debt interest and only debt interest to the $1 trillion plus mark. I explained this in detail in the Armageddon piece. Using $750 billion as a standard budget deficit throughout the 30-year period up to 2043. Bear in mind, while this figure is less than the $1 trillion average over the last 6 years, in spite of the low 2014 deficit of $483 billion, as the debt climbs to $30, $40, or $50 trillion by 2043, $750 billion will seem like peanuts. I assume what normal interest rates are, and that 6% assumption I use is reasonable. I will back that up with the chart of the last 24 years. I already did that. I showed you that chart. Bond vigilantes will play an ever larger role as the deficit grows, and in the end, it is them that will push interest rates to crisis levels in spite of everything the Federal Reserve tries to do to stop it. And I should discuss that more, but not right now. And the last one is the $22 trillion debt figure I started with is a realistic number. The video on the national debt bond explains how I arrived at that figure. I'm confident my assumptions are reasonable. If you don't agree, then I suggest you either review the other 5 videos I did on the subject, or you turn off the video. That's kind of blunt. Forget that last part. Okay, that's the end of this video. Thank you for listening. Part 2 will be coming up soon.